All right, now I'm going to show you the clothing modeling workflow that I use. So firstly, I'm going to merge visible my body mesh, and then I'm going to decimate it. And you just use Decimation Master, pre-process current, and that'll take a few moments. And then once that settles, then you decimate current, and then you can see what your poly count's going to be. So I did that twice, so I would have just about 70,000 polys. And then I'm exporting my decimated mesh, and then I'll bring it into Maya. So now I have this decimated mesh. But Marvelous deals in real world scale, and we're at 1/10 scale. So I'm going to scale it up times 10. And then export it as a scaled version, so the Marvelous settings will work better. All right, so once you're in Marvelous, go to your user settings, and under your user settings, go to View Controls, and you're going to make sure that you're on a Maya preset. Then you're going to import your OBJ, and your settings are load as avatar in centimeters, and scale is 100%, and everything else is the same. So now you have your OBJ as an avatar. And just quickly to go through how to create patterns, you would just use your pattern tool, draw on a pattern shape, duplicate it, flip it around, and then you use your seam tool to join it seam to seam, and then you simulate, and that's how you do a basic Marvelous pattern design. I'm not really going to go over how I achieve my clothing patterns, since there's a lot of free resources online that you can access that will show pretty much any kind of pattern that you need. So this is more about what settings you would use to import and export to get everything working in a production pipeline. So when you select your patterns, you can go and make sure that under miscellaneous, you turn it on quad. And under particle distance, you can increase that by choosing a lower number. All right, so now I'm going to load my costume that I've made. So I'm just going to go through and make sure that all of my patterns are quadded. And it looks like they are, so now I'm going to save my project and export. So just export OBJ, and here are my export settings. I'm exporting as a thin single object, and I'm in centimeters, and unified UV coordinates are turned on. And make sure to select all patterns. Awesome. So now I can bring in that object that I just exported, and none of my seams are joined up, but it's all one object. And all the UVs kind of match my pattern in this window. So now what I'm going to do is go here and reset 2D arrangement all, and that makes it match the pattern window, and export with the same settings, single object unweld. And now I have my UV'd flat version. So this is great because you can blend shape one to the other because it's the exact same vertex order. So I'm going to save this file, and I'm going to start retopologizing on top of the flat bits. So what I usually like to do is I start with a plane, and you can subdivide it to any number that you want. Sometimes I'll count the amount that the patch already has and kind of match that. So then what I do is I put a 2x2x2 lattice on that plane, and then I just snap each bit while the plane settings are still live, so I can adjust accordingly and keep my history that way. So now I'm just making sure that my squares are even. And now I'm going to repeat the process on each part of my costume. Start with a plane, put a 2x2x2 lattice, snap each end to the plane, and then adjust my polyplane settings to be even quads. I'm going to repeat again for the cuffs. And this is just a super quick way to get everything, mathematically even based on your clothing pattern. So I'm just making sure that that works, and then I can duplicate that same one over to the other cuff. And now on the sleeve, I can kind of start with a similar setting, but only a certain number of spans on the bottom. And I'm latticing, and then I deleted history on the lattice. And now what I'm doing is just kind of, if you make it live, you can slide along the edge of your live object. So I'm just extruding, and then I'm if your object's live, you can pull up and it'll slide against the edges of your live model. I'm just adding some divisions in there, something that makes sense. And in here, I'm adding just a few, because I'm going to average all these eventually. All right, so I'm just using the slide tool to kind of spread out my edges evenly. And if you use your middle mouse button, it's really easy to slide along the edge. So the theory here is I'll select the inverse and just pick average, and I just keep repeating with the G button. So now I'm just sliding and just trying to make all the topology very even. And then I'm averaging just to smooth it all out. And then I can duplicate that eventually to the other sleeve. But right now what I'm doing is I counted how many edges I had on my sleeve, and I'm trying to do the math and make sure I'm consistent, because when I sew from seam to seam, I'm going to want the same amount of edges on one side to the other. So I'm just being very, very conscious of that. So I know my sleeve has 16 edges all around the seam. So I think for each side of my main trunk of clothing, I'm going to want eight spans around that. So right now I'm just using the Quad Draw tool in Modeling Toolkit to draw on some topology, which is a really quick way to block it out. And the reason why I'm going through all this painstaking stuff is so I can basically control exactly how many edges for my low-res clothing that I have, and I can keep on my perfect UVs that way. And it's going to work out great for cloth simulation, because you won't have to make a whole new mesh for that. If you have it nice and evenly quadded like this, you won't have to make any new meshes for the sim artists to work with. It's kind of killing two birds with one stone. So I'm just solving topology with this puzzle, or like a puzzle, rather. Just trying to join up one area to the next. And make sure there's enough resolution between them. There we go. And then I'm just smoothing out the inside parts. And just doing my best to keep everything as even as possible. And I want to keep in mind how many up here I have, how many here I have, and that's going to join up to the next piece. So if you've already made your patterns in Marvelous, I think you kind of understand what I'm talking about, where the edges of the patterns kind of match the number to their corresponding seam side. And once you create that in Marvelous, you're gonna know, you're gonna be very familiar with your patterns to the point where you know what each side is seamed to. So now I'm doing the yoke. And just trying to keep in mind basic topology rules, like the ring of a neck and the ring of a sleeve. I want to make sure that those elements are there. And I'm just trying to keep count from one seam to the next. Making sure it's as smooth and even as possible. All right. Just adjusting, making things nice and even and clean. All right, cool. Now I'm going to move on to the back of the shirt. Going to match this number on the side here to match this side. And you can kind of do, if you snap it to a specific vert, like every third vert, then you know it's going to line up exactly when you join them together. But it's not too difficult to merge them once you have them at the right number. And as long as they're even, I think they're going to line up pretty well. And making sure, since the bottom half and the top half of the yoke are kind of the back of the shirt, that the other 8 polys that need to meet up to the sleeve are accounted for. So there's 4 on that side, and there's 4 on the yoke side. And now I'm just doing something similar as to the front of the shirt, which was just solving some topology problems, making sure things line up and that all the numbers work out, and that it's as even as possible. All right, cool. Just going to continue working on that. I'm going to make the collar. All right, now I'm going to snap to the center. Kind of average in between. I'm going to make sure that all of my verts line up to the edges. Making sure those snap to the center as well. And I'm just kind of double checking that things are lining up the way I want. Averaging the inner verts. And then just kind of lining up the rest of the topology to the edges. Same with this piece, making sure it's all even, because sometimes, when you draw right on using quad draw, it doesn't snap to where it's supposed to automatically. Here we go. Just averaging the inner bits, making sure that the edges are even. And now what I can do is I can mirror these elements, and I can snap them to the other side of the of the pattern. So now I'm going to duplicate the sleeve, mirror it over, snap it to the other pattern, make sure that that guy fits on all sides. Do the same for this piece. Just triple checking that everything's snapped. And then I went ahead and mirrored all of the patterns and combined them. And now I am completing the collar area. Trying to keep it about four edges at first. And then I can smooth it once. And then it'll match the number of edges I have on my collar. So just similar kind of thing, making sure that everything is even and lining up. All right, and I'm making sure that the center is nice and even, so I can duplicate the collar over and merge it. So just make sure my pivot's at the center. And this is the same technique I used for the rest. Combined it, snapped it to the center, and then merge verts. Great. So now I can go and I can combine that with all my skirt planes. So I'm just going to snap that to, I'm going to duplicate it so I have my history for the other ones. And then I can snap all these to the right patterns. And then what I can do is combine it all, delete history. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to transfer attributes options. So if you go to mesh, transfer attributes, you're going to want to make sure that vertex position is on and that it's sample space, or I'm sorry, you're going to want to make sure that UVs are on and sample space is world. And when you apply that, now my new mesh has the same UVs as the original mesh, which is great. But now I can see that there's two patterns stacked on top of one another on accident. So I'm just going to delete those and reverse normals. And now I'm going to transfer, since they have the same UV space, I can transfer it to the body or the sculpted clothes here using these settings. Vertex position on, and I'm sampling from UV space. So now when I hit apply, it puts everything that I just built into position, which is awesome. So now all I'll have to do is go in and merge all my verts, and I'll have perfect UVs. So I realized that I made the belt area a little bit too high res. So I'm just going back into my history that I've grouped up, and I'm gonna delete every other belt loop edge. And I'm going to reapply the transfer attributes options. There we go. Now that's much more even. And you can see all the quads are fairly similar in size. That's super important. So now what I'm going to do is I have this version, and I keep this nice old construction group, and I hide it so I can keep old construction history in there in case I need to grab it for later. I'm going to take everything back down to 1/10 scale, and I'm going to start merging all the verts in my new clothing mesh. So I definitely want to separate the skirt from the shirt. And then I'm going to go ahead and just merge verts that make sense on each area. So I'm not going to merge the center bit to the rest of the skirt. That'll be a separate piece. All right, now I'm gonna just fix up some of this mesh, this shirt mesh, and make sure that all of my edges are merged. And what's great about this is now I can polygroup in ZBrush, and I can use UVs, and every single seam that I have is going to perfectly line up with my clothing. And that matches how real world clothing works. So it'll just look more natural, and it's all for free. So now what I'm doing is I'm just merging all my verts just by hand to make sure that there's no funny business going on. Sometimes there's complications and you want to know about them, so I just kind of hand do it. It's so low res that it doesn't really... I'm just making sure that I have the right corresponding verts. And I'm using the G button to just repeat. Repeat merge. I'm going to the other side and doing the same things. There we go. I did a large section at that point just because I could see it easier. So I'm just joining the sleeves up. And it looks like the edges aren't lining up quite the way I want to, so I'll just delete non-seam edges and kind of even out the back. And that way I can line it up to the sleeves a lot better. And at this stage you can add and delete as many edge loops as you want, as long as it's not on a seam edge. And the seam edges are going to be obvious if as long as your settings have your border edges on a thickness, then it's really easy to see. I always have that on by default. All right, now I'm just trying to work out the collar, isolating just those faces and merging those verts. Awesome. Okay, now I'm merging the collar to the bottom. So sometimes if it doesn't line up, what I like to do is just add an edge loop where I want, and then slide it into position, and then I can merge it more easily. And the reason why that's better than just merging the one that's closest to it is that you get a more even UVs for free if you just insert the edge loop instead of moving it, because then that just stretches your texture UV space. So now I'm just merging these, deleting old ones. Remember, again, don't delete the ones that are on seams because that'll destroy your UVs. Great. Now these guys are merged. And I was just double checking to make sure there's no five-sided faces or ingons. And you just go to Poly Cleanup to check for that. So it's very low res, so some body parts are poking through, but that's not a problem. We can take care of that later. So now what I'm going to do is go to my old folder, which is my construction history, so I can separate out those buttons. And what I'm going to do is create a whole new button based on this button shape and just place it roughly in the same spot that the Marvelous buttons came in at. So I'm just poly modeling these buttons out of a cylinder. Just making some protective edges to make sure that they smooth nicely. And since it's a medium res character, I'm probably not going to model in those buttonholes. So what I'll do instead is make a torus, very low res. And then I can make the little cross thread that sews, and that will kind of sell the idea that there's buttonholes underneath there. So then I can combine those two threads and do some quick UVs. It's just cylindrical and then unfolding. Combine those thread UVs and delete the bottom half because you don't need that. And then you can group those as one button. And I'm just going to lay these out real quick. Just using the Unfold 3D. Although the ratio is not quite working the way I want. I'll just use regular layout for that. There we go. And I'm going to change all this later, but at least you have perfectly working UVs now. So now I'm just going to unhide my old buttons. Just duplicated out that piece and deleting everything but my buttons. Putting it back at 0, 0, 0. And I'm just snapping my new buttons into place. And they don't have to be perfectly in the same spot, but roughly. And it's just a really good guide and placeholder for where the buttons should go, especially since Marvelous kind of simulates everything very realistically. So I'm just placing all these guys. And now I have my costume, I have my buttons. Everything is scaled. Ooh, I'm missing one. Let's duplicate that. And when I project, the collar will snap down there. Great. Now I have perfectly working Geo, and I can export each piece. My original costume, my skirt, my shirt, and my buttons, all combined. And next, I'm going to start sculpting the clothes in ZBrush.